TitleMatchNetwork.com.
Let's talk about how Turner Broadcasting handled WCW and what the corporate culture working for Turner Broadcasting was like. Flair has said that Turner would just give his friends jobs in different places in the company, which led to a lot of bloat. Is that a fair assessment?
That Ted would give
Uh,
friends jobs in
yeah,
the company? That was the first I've heard that. Ted wasn't really doing a lot of the hiring. There's a big misconception about that. I mean, Ted bought the company. Ted was very invested in it, not from a financial point of view, but he believed in wrestling. If you read Ted's autobiography, he talks a lot about wrestling and why he wanted it on WTCG, I think it was, which is the beginning of CNN. So Ted was a very passionate fan and supporter of the business, but I don't think he really had a lot of operational influence over it, at least not while I was there. I know he didn't. There were people in senior management when I got there that, quite frankly, I don't have any idea whether they were friends of Ted Turner or not. Perhaps they were, and Flair would know better than I, because I wasn't there in the beginning. But I never got that impression.
Okay. Why do you think the company had been so mismanaged around this period of time, in the early 90s?
Well, people talk about the mismanagement of WCW in the early 90s and why that was. You got to put everything into context. Ted Turner bought a bankrupt company that was already mismanaged and dysfunctional. It was in bankruptcy, for Christ's sake.
Right.
So, and that was, I think, in 1988 or 1989. When you buy something that's broken, and you try to fix it with many of the people that were responsible for breaking it in the first place, the transition from the Crockett's to Turner Broadcasting, yes, they had television, and that solves a lot of problems. But television is one component of a very complex maze of, or a kaleidoscope of things that all have to fit together in order to work. And, it took a couple of years, 2, 3, 4 years, to figure it out. And they went through a lot of management. They tried a couple different things. And in retrospect, did it take them 5 years to turn it around? 6 years? Yeah. But that's quite an accomplishment in many respects.
Were you a student of the game around this period of time? I mean, did you study the business? Did you understand, the Crockett's, and did you understand the background to the wrestling business at all? I know you were in AWA, but
I really didn't know the kind of regional history, especially of the South. I understood the Midwest because of my job at AWA. I had to understand Vern's company and Vern's product in the Midwest from a promotional point of view, from a syndication point of view. Sure, I knew the Midwest, and I felt like I was fairly knowledgeable of that part of the business. But keep in mind, when I was living in Minneapolis during that time, I didn't get WCW. I didn't get the NWA, really. And so I was not very knowledgeable of the gene or the genetic tissue, I guess I would say, of the NWA and all of its history.
In the early 90s, what do you think the biggest problem WCW faced while trying to compete with WWE?
Oh, gosh. There were many. If you start at the very basic level, or the foundation of WCW at that time, we're talking about early 90s, when they're trying, and I don't know necessarily that they were trying to compete with the WWF or E at that time, or F at that time, but they were trying to be successful. And they had a lot of things going against them. They were a national television network that had a very regional nucleus. Their product at that time, while they were trying to appeal to an audience in Los Angeles and New York and Chicago and the big television markets that are critical to a national television rating, they were trying to do so with a very regionalized product that was great for the Southeast, but didn't really speak the same cultural language and meet the expectation of the audience in New York or LA. So that was one hurdle that took a while to overcome. Another was just the internal strife and politics of the way Turner Corporate looked at the product. nobody other than Ted Turner wanted that company there. Nobody. At least when I got there. There were constant rumblings, and some of them probably rumors, but some of it I know was true in retrospect. And even while it was happening, there was a lot of corporate resistance to even having wrestling on the network. So when you're the corporate entity that you work for and you work with doesn't really want you there, but can't really get rid of you because the guy at the very top likes you, you don't get a lot of support. And that was a big part of their problem. And it ended up being the biggest part of their problem at the very end. The rest of it was just growing pains, getting the right people in the right positions. Yeah.
Let's talk about TBS adding Thunder as a series. You've written that as the one time you should have said no instead of doing what was asked of you. Explain that. Why is that?
Because I knew we couldn't do it. We couldn't pull it off. We were at capacity. It was everything that we could do to be good at what we were doing. Just from an infrastructure point of view, as far as cameramen and trucks and staff and all of the things it took to do the 5 syndicated shows that we were doing and do a weekly show on primetime on TNT. We were at capacity, and to double that capacity without doubling the infrastructure was too much. And I knew it when I got the phone call. I knew it.
Is it true that you guys were producing Thunder without getting any revenue stream for it?
We weren't getting any revenue stream from anything that we produced.
Yes.
So of course.
Okay. I was going to ask, how does that even happen when that you're producing Thunder and you're not getting any revenue for it? Because
we weren't licensing our show to our own network. We were producing our show for the network. It wasn't. They didn't pay us $200,000 or $300,000. No, we had a budget to produce the show. I mean, they paid us what it cost us to do it, but it wasn't like, and even that, there's a caveat to that. We'll see where this goes, and I'll bring you back to it if necessary. But it became a huge burden on us from a financial point of view, but more from just people, staff, talent.
Is it true that Turner execs cost WCW a deal to have live NBC specials? Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. What happened with that?
I had a deal. I had pitched a deal. It was shortly after the Jay Leno thing. I had some good relationships at NBC and at a fairly high level. And there was the NBA, I think, was going on strike one year, and they were kind of like in a programming scramble.
Right.
And I got a call from one of my friends at NBC and said, "Hey, what do you think?" I said, "We could do a special." And the special was going to be, I was going to get Dennis Rodman and Carmen Electra were going to get divorced on television. Yeah. I was going to have a divorce ceremony as a part of that special.
That'd been awesome. Do you think WCW was in a position where they couldn't win at this point? And I guess, was there any way to prevent the company from being overexposed?
Well, was there a way? Hindsight, was there a way? No, not under the circumstances that we're in. Not with a Time Warner acquisition and an AOL acquisition, along with all the politics that went along with that and everybody's agendas on the corporate side. Not with what happened to our budget. Not with the demoralization, I guess, if that's the right word, to the company as a result of everything that happened. How we would have pulled the nose up under those conditions, I'm just not quite sure.
How much did the Turner broadcasting structure and environment begin to strip away at the WCW?
Again, so many of what I'm guessing to be your audience is going to reject what I'm going to say, because they've been saturated with a narrative that is counter to the facts for so long that everybody believes it. Time Warner was announced, the Time Warner-Turner merger was announced sometime in 1995, I'm guessing. Happened sometime in 1996, I think, is when it finally was official. When that happened, initially there was, in fact, that's funny. I went to a Christmas party in December, the president of Turner Broadcasting's house, Terry McGurk. It was a select group of executives that were invited and their wives. It was a big group, but it was key executives. Gerald Levin was there. Ted wasn't there, but Gerald Levin was there. And Gerald Levin came in, and I remember everybody toasted and saying how great it was going to be that the culture and the strength and the scope of Time Warner was going to be infused by the entrepreneurial spirit of Ted Turner and the Turner Company. I remember that because Ted was an entrepreneur, and anybody in that company that was successful was an entrepreneur. Ted expected you to take risks, expected you to fail, expected you to succeed more than you failed, but he encouraged a ballsy approach to the business because that's how he did it. And that's why I was passionate about helping him be successful and me be successful there. It was a great environment for me. It's because of the way my DNA is. And I remember hearing that going, fuck, this is going to be great. Because I didn't know. I had never been a part of a merger before. I had no idea how they really worked. And I was excited about it. I remember about 3, 4, 5, 6 months later, I don't remember who I was talking to, but it was somebody who had been around the block. Might have been an attorney or somebody who'd been through that merger and acquisition shit. And I said, no, this is great, Time Warner. And he said, Eric, trust me when I tell you, it's not going to happen overnight. There's not going to be immediate changes, but the culture is going to change. And Time Warner is not going to become more like Turner. It's going to be the opposite. Fuck you. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't worry about it. Sure enough, everything started changing. Everything. And at the same time, unbeknownst not only to me, but to Ted Turner himself, he didn't even know that there were moves being made to undermine his control over his own company. Right on the heels of Time Warner, you've got AOL. At that time, every executive in the company only wanted to protect their own ass. All of them were vested with stock options. I became a millionaire because of stock options, okay, that I didn't even know I had, to be really honest about it. It was like, wow, lottery ticket. But the guys above me, people who were a lot smarter and experienced than I was, everybody was trying to protect their kingdom. And a number of divisions got killed in that crossfire, mine being one of them. But there's a book called When Fools Rush In. The author's name is Nina Monk. And I encourage anybody who thinks I'm full of shit to read that book and see from that author's perspective, not what happened just to me, but to CNN and to a lot of other divisions in that company. And we got banged the hardest because WCW, every other company, whether it's Castle Rock Entertainment or New Line Cinema or TNT or CNN or all the other operating divisions within the company, each had their own accounting, and you could pick it, and you could look at it, and you see what everybody's doing. WCW didn't. WCW fell into what they called an other category. It was just lumped into a bunch of other shit, and it wasn't broken down. But what happened is we became so successful that there was, we were doing $300, $400 million a year in revenues, okay? But other people wanted to start allocating those revenues, and they wanted to start cutting the costs so that they could build up their line items at our expense. Add to that, there were people in the company that didn't want us there in the first place, that never wanted us to be successful. The fact that we were was like, oh God, now what are we going to do? Now there was a reason for it, financial motivation to move this over here, and let's take this loss over here. We'll take this loss, and we don't really want it on our side, so we'll move it over here. And we got killed. So a long-winded, answer to your story. All this stuff is going on in 98, and we're successful. My budget was approved the year before for 1999, okay?
Right.
The year before, it was approved. Now we go to 1999, and all of a sudden I get a phone call that says, yeah, I know what we said we were going to give you, but you got to reduce that by X. Wait a minute. I just started doing another show called Thunder. How am I going to make it? How am I supposed to do that? I don't care. It's mandated across the boards. We need a 18% EBITDA, which is an accounting term.
Right.
And we need that, and we're going to cut your budget because we need to allocate some of this over here. It's like, you got to be kidding me. But they still wanted the ratings. And that was the beginning of the end. And that's when Kevin Nash came in. And that's when my conflicts with, the executive side of Turner, became really, really pronounced.
I got a lot of stuff adding up to this, so we'll jump right into it. How much of the problems that you or Vince Russo or anyone else got blamed were actually caused by Turner issues? I mean, you pretty much, yeah.
I mean, it's too broad a question. I mean,
Well,
I think the beginning of the end for us was Thunder,
Okay.
and then add to that the Time Warner AOL merger and the internal pressure to cut costs and reallocate budgets was traumatic. Now, if they would have said, you know what, we're going to pull the plug on Thunder, we're not going to do that anymore and just focus on Nitro, it would have been okay. But that's not what happened.
Is it true that Turner Broadcasting once tried to force you guys to give them scripts a month in advance to be screened by standards and practices?
Well, you're jumping right into that period of time now,
Right.
but because prior, I didn't even know what standards and practices was up until sometime in '99. Because I never had to go through that process before. I mean, I knew what it was, but it was never part of anything I had to think about. And then because of Time Warner, because of AOL and everybody doing what they were doing and the culture shifting from being a Turner culture to a different type of culture, we'll call it an AOL because they're not around anymore and it's easy to put the heat on them. But it happened. I don't know if they wanted a month in advance, but they wanted them in advance.
Do you think that would have really hurt the company? And how do they not understand how wrestling, which they went for over a decade, was, produced? How do they not realize that?
Well, again, it wasn't Turner anymore. It was Time Warner, and Time Warner had never been in the wrestling business.
Okay. You might have already answered this, but I'm just going to answer the questions anyway. Break down how the corporate structure in Turner changing as the AOL merger came closer changed things. How was it that Turner and Schiller, weren't providing more support either?
It's a little hard to explain and put it into context. Ted Turner didn't even know that they were pulling the rug out from Ted Turner, and he was the co-chairman of the company. So it's hard to explain how the ripple down of that was. Again, you go back to a lot of what we talked about in the last couple hours. You have a group of people, executives, the majority of whom didn't want the property on the network to begin with. They were either embarrassed by it, or they thought it was lowbrow, or they didn't understand it, or they thought it was too violent, or they wanted a cool movie to be in that space, or they wanted the money and the resources that were being allocated to us for their own, whatever it was. Everybody had their own motivations, I'm sure. But you've got a culture of executives who really don't want it to be there at Turner. You've got Ted Turner, who for years was the advocate for WCW and protected it from those people. Now you've got a Time Warner and a culture of Time Warner that's got everybody over here scared anyway, the WCW side. The WCW people are trying, not the WCW, the Turner people are trying to become a Time Warner people. But now you've got AOL coming down over the top of them and everybody's scrambling to protect their turf. The trickle down from that was amazing. But the important part to understand within the context of WCW is that if Ted Turner didn't, and Ted Turner has talked about this in interviews, if Ted didn't even know what was going on behind his back in his own company, you can only imagine the kind of impact that it had on the entire organization. Not just WCW, but CNN,
Right.
Headline News, New Line, Castle Rock. I mean,
do you regret not just calling it a day and walking out?
Yes. I do. I've talked about that before.
How bad did it hurt WCW morale when Turner Broadcasting moved the company's headquarters out of CNN Center?
I think it did a lot. I didn't notice it at the time. I mean, I didn't. I noticed it. I didn't like it, but I underestimated just how much it made everybody feel like not only the redheaded stepchild at the family reunion that nobody really wanted to talk to. Now they didn't even really want us to come to the reunion.
TitleMatchNetwork.com